Good afternoon and welcome to this month's Young Leaders Circle event with Dave Rubin, the host of the Rubin Report and the author of the excellent new book, Don't Burn This Book, Thinking for Yourself in an Age of Unreason. For a number of years now, Dave has been one of the pioneers of new media. Dave can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe most people who engage with the Rubin Report do so on YouTube, though it is also available as a podcast and on the Blaze subscription service. When I checked yesterday, the Rubin Report had just under 1.4 million YouTube subscribers. Dave's professional background is in comedy, and his political background is as a man of the left. He was an intern at The Daily Show, and before the Rubin Report struck out on its own, it was a part of the Young Turks Network, which is a progressive, online native news site for those who might be unfamiliar. In his book and across the arc of his show, Dave traces his intellectual conversion from progressivism to classical liberalism. He is a leading voice in conversations over free speech, cancel culture, and censorship. Without any further wind-up, I want to jump into these topics and much else. Dave, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, it's good to be with you. You know, before we start, I do want to be very clear. I'm doing an Amy Coney Barrett right now. I've got nothing on my notes in front of me. So this is all going to be stream of conscience, my friend.
This is rather humbling because you happen to be one of the most skillful interviewers working right now. You had words of praise for Larry King, but I've got to say, for a different generation, you are more than their Larry King. You're someone who's been introducing literally millions of Americans, young and old, to a set of ideas the mainstream does not give exposure to. You've created this new pipeline for a really vital, creative, rich intellectual life that just wouldn't be there if you weren't there doing it. So I'm curious, so it's kind of funny, given that you're someone who has become this thought leader, someone who's become a conduit for this new amazing intellectual energy you're seeing across the political spectrum, you started out in comedy. So how is it that you cut your teeth in that world? What is it that you learned in that world that then shaped you as a thinker and as someone who's built a platform for thinkers?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for all the kind words. You know, as I often tell people, I used to be funny. In a different life, I was funny. The funny part about that, of course, is that when I do comedy clubs now, and I don't really consider myself a comic anymore in a traditional sense, but you know, if I'm touring or I'm in other towns, unfortunately now because of lockdowns, it doesn't happen too often. But for example, during the year and a half that I toured with Jordan Peterson, often if we had an off night, I would get to the town early. And because my show has done well, let's say, I can sell out a comedy club just by putting my name there. And really what I do now in terms of comedy is I just get up there, and if there's a couple hundred people in the audience, and fortunately we sold out every show that I've done in the last couple of years, I just get up there and I have a couple thoughts in mind, or what's happening in the world, what's going on with current events. And I talk to the crowd, and I do some Q&A, and I get people interacting with each other. So it's not traditional stand-up in any way, but I would say that the 12 years of stand-up that I did in New York City before that, and the road work and that kind of stuff, I think what it set me up to do well is listen. Because, you know, people think of stand-up comedy as a one-way medium, in that you're the comedian, you're telling jokes, and yeah, you get laughs, but in essence, it's really all about you. But what I always felt about comedy was the laughs and the type of laughs that you get, and when you get the laughs and the rhythm of the laughs, that really can be a conversation. Because, you know, sometimes a good comic, it's like if you get a real laugh, what you notice in that laugh is there's the initial laugh, then sometimes there's a lull, then somebody else in the crowd that maybe didn't get the original punchline, they start laughing, that might then trigger someone else to laugh again, and then you have to play within that. And I think that I didn't realize it probably really until I was writing my book, and I had to start thinking about a little bit about my history that sort of led me here. But I think doing stand-up in that way, listening to the crowd and being willing, you know, if something was really working, being willing to really go for it, and if something really wasn't working, being willing to make a move on the fly. I think that's very much how I approach interviewing. So I really never have an agenda. I sit down with someone, and sure, I have a couple points usually that I want to get to, and every now and again there might be a specific line that I want to quote them on, or an order of chronology that I need to know. But beyond that, I like sitting down with somebody and hearing what they have to say, and then hopefully if you're interviewing somebody that's worth interviewing, they're going to say something that then will take you as the interviewer and go, oh, well, now let's go there, as opposed to having a predetermined destination, which then it's like, I could do something else for a living. That just seems boring to me.
Was the discipline that required something that came naturally to you, or it's something that was cultivated through years of putting yourself out there?
I think that my disposition, a lot of people ask me some version of this question, like, why am I tolerant of different ideas? Because I can have a lefty on and I can have a conservative on and everything in between that. And I give you my word, I have treated every single one of my guests exactly the same. That doesn't mean I agree with them all. And one of the hard things for me particularly over the last year, but even the 6 months since the book has come out, because the book came out in April, is that now, in a weird way, I'm sort of known now more for my own thoughts, my own ideas, and my own political evolution, where as an interviewer for the years before that, it was much more about the guest. And now what I find is when I'm interviewing somebody, my audience has a sense of what I really think about the issues, but I'm not there to berate someone that I disagree with. So I can give you an interesting example. I had Marianne Williamson on when she was, running for president during the Democratic primaries. And Marianne, in essence, I think she's a lovely woman, but in essence, she's a collectivist. She believes in group identity, and that's more important than individual identity. Now, I suspect I know your feelings on this are probably a little more in line with mine, which is that I believe that the sovereign individual is the basic building block of society, and that you should build up from that. Where generally collectivists, they believe in group identity and sort of a top-down view of the world. And I believe in a bottom-up view of the world. Now, as I was interviewing her, it became very obvious that at a certain level, we were at an intractable position on this because we fundamentally disagree. But I wasn't there to debate her. I was there to have her on my show and present her opinions. But what I did do in the middle of the interview is I said to her, totally respectfully, I said, Marianne, I just want to put it out there for my audience. You have a collectivist worldview and I have an individualist worldview. That's just fine, but I think it's important to say, otherwise my audience will think, oh, she's saying all of these things that we know Dave doesn't believe, but he's letting her just sort of steamroll through him. So that is one of the trickier parts as an interviewer, and I've discussed it many times with my friend and mentor, Larry King. For the decades that Larry was the preeminent interviewer in America and at some level in the world, his own opinions were left out of that completely. And now as Larry's gotten older and he's into his, mid 80s, he's more opinionated now publicly than he was before, because he's not doing interviewing as much at this point. So, he's doing a podcast, but it's different than the heyday when we all think of Larry King on CNN in the midst of, the O.J. Simpson thing and all that. So I think it's part of the nature of being a YouTube person, that being a pure interviewer where nobody knows what you think, I don't think that really flies anymore. I think I want my audience to see me as a complete person, but that doesn't preclude me from treating my guests with respect.
I'm curious about the comedy scene when you were really steeped in it. And, it seems that comedy right now feels very political, but it also feels very predictable. Part of this is the idea of punching down. Part of this is the idea that comedians have an obligation, have a social obligation to, frankly, take a certain set of positions. Now, you've obviously broken out of that mold, but I want you to tell us a bit about that psychology, that frame of mind that you encountered, and how it affected you even at the time before you went through your political evolution.
Yeah, I love this question because it sums up a lot of what I talk about and sort of what got me here. Right behind me on my set, you can't quite see it, but I've got about 100 old stand-up tapes above me, VHS and mini DV tapes from the old days. And I've got about a couple dozen old stand-up notebooks with scribblings on them. And when I've looked through the notebooks occasionally, I see that 20 years ago, I was talking about, in many ways, the very same things I was talking about now. I was making fun of CNN before everybody was making fun of CNN, and talking about Wolf Blitzer and anonymous sources and all of these things that now, you open Twitter and everyone's making fun of mainstream media all the time. I was always sort of focused on media. I was a political science major. I went to SUNY Binghamton in New York. So I was always doing political stuff. But what's interesting to me about the question is that most comics, if they really understood the political lens, they're really libertarians. I mean, what do comedians want? They want to tell you the way they view the world. And usually within that, they're going to talk about drugs, they're going to talk about sex, they're going to talk about things that aren't culturally necessarily acceptable by the mainstream, but that's what sort of pushes the conversation forward. What oddly happened about 10 years ago, sometime probably at the beginning of the Obama administration, is that suddenly to be cool, it almost exclusively had to be a Democrat. Now, you could take who I think was the greatest cultural and political comedian we ever had, George Carlin, and his thoughts on everything. You could put all across the political map. Mostly, he just wanted to tell you what he thought about the world and fight the power structures. That's what you're talking about. But suddenly, we got this crew of comedians, sort of the Samantha Bees, now what's happened to Stephen Colbert and all the late night guys, Jimmy Kimmel. And I'm not even saying this to put them down per se, Sarah Silverman, the rest of them, where they've put their leftism as if they're so morally right. They've put that ahead of their comedy. And by the way, that's why everyone's tuning out of these things. I mean, Greg Gutfeld's show on Fox News is the highest rated late night show, at least in the comedy division. I mean, it's better rated than those shows. I happen to be friends with Greg and know Greg, and I do the show. He's got about 6 people on staff on that show. I mean, it is a true skeleton crew, and the stuff that's coming out of his mouth is coming out of his mind. Where those guys, Kimmel and the rest of them, they've got 20 writers and staffs of probably several hundred people and the budgets that are absolutely crazy. And in a weird way, people are tuning out of it because comedy has become, for these people, a way of lecturing you as opposed to a way of making you laugh. And that's why one of the things that I see online all the time is the people that are making me laugh right now and making me think, they generally are right-leaning people because they're a little out of the mainstream. It doesn't matter what you think about Trump per se, but the memes and the silly videos and all of the stuff that comes out of sort of the Trump side of this is way, way funnier and edgier and more culturally relevant than anything coming out of the left these days. And that's a real flip on the way it used to be.
This book is about your ideas, it's about your political evolution, but it's also a handbook. It's also you giving your readers a set of tools for how to kind of be authentic, be true to themselves and their own beliefs and ideals, to think for themselves. And I'm curious, you argue in the book, you observe rather, that one reason why you're well positioned to help people do that is because you've come out before, first as gay and then as someone who no longer belonged to the left. Can you talk to us a bit about how you see those experiences relating to each other? Were they kind of similarly consequential for your life and your friendships and your relationships?
Yeah, well, first, let me just hit the first part of that, which is that, the way I wrote this book, I'm not trying to convince anyone that I am absolutely right about any of these issues. I believe that the classical liberal framework is the best way to look and create a free society, meaning individual rights, free markets, logic, reason, and then within that, I lay out what my political positions are. But I'm truly not trying to convince anyone that I am absolutely right on the position I take on abortion, which is, first trimester abortions. I'm not trying to convince anyone I'm absolutely right. I lay out a flat tax with a couple little caveats. I'm not saying I'm right about all those things. What the book really is, and that's, I think, why you called it a handbook, in essence, it's, hey, this is what I think about it. This is why I think and have come to these conclusions, but hopefully you'll think about these things for yourself. To answer the second part of the question, I mean, look, the coming out thing, I think the fact that I'm gay, I've been with my husband for 10 years, we've been married for 5. I mean, that's the least interesting thing about me, probably. It is a thing, but it doesn't encapsulate everything about me. I can't say that it doesn't shape any of my worldview, because I think anyone that is a minority at some level, whether it's because of skin color or sexuality or whatever it might be, it shouldn't dominate your worldview, but it does color your worldview in a certain way. Anyone that is the other in any society, you will have it might just be, if mainstream is this, it might just be a little bit one way or a little bit the other, that you can see something that maybe someone else can't see. And that's what I would say I have in that regard in terms of sexuality. As far as the political closet, I mean, I actually think that the political closet is far more dangerous than the closet related to sexuality, especially in 2020. Look, if you come out as gay in 2020, first off, you will be rewarded and lauded, and the media will love you, and you'll get extraordinary love from so many people. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a 15-year-old somewhere in the country that could still be struggling with these things, both internally and within their family, and we can have all those conversations about religion and the rest of it, all legit. But generally speaking, if you come out as a gay person in 2020, there's no hit to you. There's no, if anything, there'll be a lot of rewards for it. And it might even help you get a job at this point, because that now counts as diversity. So that's one thing. But the political closet, which I describe really as when you come out as anything but woke, in effect, when you come out as anything but a diehard leftist, and you say, oh, there's these 10 things that these lefties believe, and I actually only believe in 8 of them. But these 2 things, I don't really believe in 8-month abortions. That seems like a bit much. Or I don't believe in, free everything, whatever it might be. We can whittle down all the specific issues. What will happen is they will turn on you. And I think that anyone watching this has probably experienced this. You will lose friends. You will have family members turn on you. You will be mobbed on Facebook. You'll be blocked by people. You'll have teachers that'll be angry at you, and coworkers and the rest of it. But what I know to be true is that when you come out of the closet, whatever that might be, when you say, this is who I am, this is what I think, although there is a pain point, and as I said, those things will happen to you, when you get to the other side, well, A, you'll be living for yourself, which I think is the most important thing you can do as a person, as a human being. But B, you will realize, whoa, there are all these bridges to be built in a direction that I did not even see. And I think I've just been very honest about my experience within that. And I think it's helped map that for other people. I'm very proud of that.
You were talking earlier on about this distinction between a collectivist frame of mind and an individualistic frame of mind. And one interesting tension here is that there are some people for whom their collective identity is hugely meaningful and consequential for them. And so if you're identified as an Uncle Tom, if you're identified as someone who's defecting from the group, that can be very painful when that group identity is something that you feel has nourished you, is something that's been very valuable to you. Can you tell us a little bit about that dynamic? Because I imagine that's something that, as you're counseling people, in a sense, to be true to themselves, to think for themselves, that can be a big barrier for people.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it within the Uncle Tom context, which obviously brings us to, let's say, Black people who are leaving the Democratic Party, or who are at least saying, these policies actually haven't helped us. Now, there are a long list of incredible thinkers and brave people who have been talking about this for a long time. I put Thomas Sowell, the brilliant libertarian economist at Stanford, I put him at the top of the list on this, and he has been banging this drum for a long, long time, and trying to tell Black people, you don't have to be a Democrat just because you are Black. In many cases, it is the big government policies and the handouts of the Democratic Party that have harmed the Black family, that have kept people in a cycle of poverty and the rest of it. There's Larry Elder, who's been doing it for years, and as you probably know, was key in my wake-up moment in all of this. And then I would say, of course, my good friend Candace Owens, who in the last couple of years has become just an engine unto herself, who has woken up, I truly think, millions and millions of people. And by the way, I think that's going to be very reflective in the election results, in a couple of weeks. But when you believe in collectivism, meaning in essence, because you are Black, you should think this. Because you are gay, you should think this. And because you're a woman, you should think this. Well, in essence, what you're saying is your individual thoughts have no meaning, that it's been predetermined because of your skin color that you should accept these certain policies. And I think when you calmly explain that to people, everyone knows that's not true. You would never, I could look at you knowing nothing else I know of you and say, well, he's got brownish skin, so he must believe these sort of things, right? I mean, that's bigotry, right? I mean, that's bigotry. In essence, that's racism. It's a crazy way. It's actually dehumanizing. That's what I've tried to explain to people. The most fundamental thing you can do as a human, as I said before, is think for yourself. If you can't, I mean, what separates us from the animals? It's the fact that we can think for ourselves. In essence, they're trying to take that away from you and say, okay, well, we care about Black people, we care about gay people, we care about women, but it doesn't make any sense because you don't like Black conservatives. I mean, listen to the things that they say about Larry Elder, Uncle Tom. Listen to the things they say about Candace Owens. Listen to the things that they say about right-leaning gay people like Peter Thiel or Rick Grinnell, and the list goes on, or what they would say about right-leaning women, like Sarah Huckabee Sanders or Amy Coney Barrett or Nikki Haley. So the idea that you would believe in a group identity above the individual, I think it's deeply dangerous. And what I'm happy about right now is it seems like a lot of people are waking up to this. A lot of people are now hearing the Democrats call everybody racist. Everyone that they disagree with is racist. Everyone that they disagree with is a homophobe and a misogynist. And it's just not working anymore. And I also think that's partly why things have gotten so hysterical, because when your arguments aren't very good, generally, unfortunately, people tend to double down instead of saying, oh, maybe I've been doing something wrong here.
This is fascinating. When you talk about the they, you're talking about this progressive left that is actually regressive, to use your language. But also it seems that many of the people in these conversations, many of the people making these denunciations themselves have some doubt about what it is they're doing. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, I hope they have some doubt. I try not to impugn people's motives. And by the way, when I say they, and I'm usually talking about sort of the woke far left progressives, I don't mean everyone that is on the left. Of course, there are good people on the left. My mom is on the left. I was a lefty most of my life. So I understand that. But when I talk about they, what I'm talking about is sort of the machinery that now drives virtually everything on the left, which is now rife with critical race theory, which actually is racist. And it is completely infected by identity politics, which is the most anti-American set of ideas that you could possibly have. America, the whole idea of America, bring us your poor and your huddled masses. Everyone came here, right? Your personal story of how your parents or ancestors got here is different than mine. But what lays beneath that is they came here to make a better life. And look at the two of us right now. I guarantee you that our lives are way better than our grandparents and our great-grandparents. This thing has been an extraordinary success. And what is coming out of so much of the left right now is that it was fundamentally founded on racism, right? The 1619 Project. And that in essence, that has been the driving force of our 250-year history. And that's not just untrue, it's dangerous, because America has given more freedoms to more people than any place on earth. And if you don't believe me on that, I mean, the simple truth is nobody's leaving. No, you know who leaves America? The billionaires who want to hide some tax money. But nobody else, the people who run around telling you how horrible America is all day, there's no place that they would rather go. Where are you going to go? And if you know a place, tell me, because nobody seems to go there.
There was this one anecdote in the book that I found very affecting. You were talking about this moment when Cenk Uygur, someone who is a partner to you, someone with whom you work very closely, was really just ripping into David Webb and just talking about him in this way that just didn't comport with your experience of David Webb. And I thought that was interesting because it was almost as though this thing that anchored you was knowing this person, knowing this was a decent person, and then hearing that person kind of dehumanized and dismissed. Can you tell us a little bit about that incident and how that crystallized things for you a bit?
Yeah, so I laid this out as really one of the three moments that truly woke me up to what was wrong with the left, that sort of got me from going from woke to awake, in essence. And what this was years ago, I was on air with the Young Turks, and there was a panel of about four of us, and they were playing a clip of Fox News. And David Webb, for those watching that don't know David Webb, he's a conservative radio host on Sirius XM, and he sometimes is a Fox News contributor, and he happens to be Black. And he was on air. I think he was guest hosting for Hannity, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't even remember off the top of my head what the specific issue was that they were talking about, but everyone on the panel, including Cenk, who is the head of the Young Turks, was talking about what a racist he is and an Uncle Tom and a sellout, and he hates himself and all of these things. And what they didn't know is that years before I was at the Young Turks, I had a show on Sirius XM, and I was a lefty at the time. And one day in the hallway, I met David Webb. We just started talking, and we immediately became friends. And I would go on his show about once a week, and I was the lefty, he was on the right, and we'd argue it out, but it was always fun. We were always laughing, always smiling, and then we'd go right downstairs to Del Frisco's, have a steak and whiskey, and it was all good. It just didn't matter that we disagreed about some political stuff. But as I watched the people who purport to be the anti-racists attacking this man with the worst sort of language, the worst sort of prejudice. Prejudice, of course, means to prejudge. They didn't care that he can think for himself. They didn't care that he's come up with a different view of the world, that he believes in a different economic system that they believe in, or whatever it might be. All they saw was black man who does not behave the way we want black man to behave. And because I knew David, that was one of the three that was so crystal clear. And I think that's what happens to a lot of young people, that, you know, we can talk about all of this stuff sort of at the idea level, right, at the idea tier, but then something will happen to you in your own life. And when that thing happens to you, it becomes obvious. And that was one of the ones where I was like, wow, it's the anti-racists who are actually racist. That doesn't mean that David Webb, nor me, nor you, is right about every theory that we have. But what it means is we want to be judged by who we are and the ideas that we put out there and the actions that we put into the universe.
We're starting to get some questions from the audience, and I want to encourage everyone, whichever platform you're using, please ask questions of Dave. But first, a question from Tim. What does Dave think the relationship will be going forward between legacy and new media, particularly in the conservative ecosystem? Does the success of his show and those like it suggest legacy media was missing something fundamental?
Yeah, I love this question. And in many ways, I'm more interested in this topic at a certain level more than politics right now. You know, one of the things that I keep tweeting about is how politics, if your whole worldview is politics, if you just don't have a philosophic worldview that fits politics in that bucket, or a religious worldview, or whatever it might be, you're going to be endlessly miserable, because politics is a quest for power. And for anyone watching this that watched Game of Thrones, I mean, Game of Thrones ends, everybody's basically dead except 5 guys at a table, and everyone they know is dead. So it's like, that's what politics is. And that's why what you see right now out of so much of the left is such anger and hysteria and all of this stuff, because they don't view the world in any other way than outside of what they think at any given moment, which is really what politics is. As for media, you know, it's funny, for years I said, I wish the media could just be a little bit better, because if they were, I would find something else to do. And I genuinely meant it. You know, when I wake up every morning and it's like, oh man, CNN just absolutely, you know, the headline doesn't match the story, or they're ignoring a particularly big story, which, by the way, as you know, in the book, I lay out several types of fake news. And one of the types of fake news I talk about is people think of fake news as just, oh, it's a made up story, or the headline doesn't match the actual story, the written word. But one of the types of fake news, and I think the most nefarious one, is that when they ignore stories that don't fit the narrative. That is a type of fake news. And actually, even right now, as we're taping this, there's a story that you may not have even seen yet, but last night, there was a video that was going viral of a young black man on a Southwest Airlines plane. He happens to have a Trump 2020 mask and a Black Voices for Trump hat. And he's being kicked off a plane because they're claiming he didn't have his mask on, even though he was just eating nuts and he had a cup of coffee. And there's a woman videotaping the whole thing, a white woman who he happened to be traveling with. And this is the type of story that if this guy wasn't wearing a Trump mask and didn't have a Black Voices for Trump hat, this is the type of story the media would love. They would absolutely love. Oh, black man kicked off plane by white attendant. Run with this. It proves that we're systemically racist and the rest of it. Now, they're not touching the story. And I actually just this morning, we haven't put it up yet, I just interviewed the gentleman and the woman that he was traveling with, who happens to be she teaches the Constitution. That's why they were traveling together, actually. But that is a type of fake news, and that goes to why legacy media is failing. I say it all the time. I'm not a journalist. I tell you what I think. I can ingest whatever's happening in the world, and I think I can communicate it clearly to people. So, if say Jordan Peterson, when I had Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro on my show, and they're talking, and we were talking about religion and the nature of truth and some seriously high level stuff, I think what I've become good at is taking that stuff, and then there's a way to communicate that to the average person that also has to work a job and not spend all day thinking about these things and everything else. The legacy media has failed because they've decided to be activists rather than journalists. And what I mean by that is, take anyone on CNN. Do you think Jake Tapper is a Republican or a Democrat? It's pretty obvious. Do you think Brian Stelter is a Republican or a Democrat? It's pretty obvious. Wolf Blitzer, Don Lemon, obviously. Chris Cuomo, obviously. Everyone on MSNBC. I would hold Fox to a separate thing because they're the only one that is right-leaning and they're not denying it. But in essence, and I think this is really this is the secret that Trump understood before anyone else, that people thought, oh, an election is about Democrats fighting Republicans. It's about liberals fighting conservatives. But in essence, what Trump saw was, oh, it's about Republicans, conservatives fighting Democrats, liberals, and the media. And he basically has thrown a wrench into the media machinery, and the media is just breaking down right now. So while I don't consider myself a journalist, it's like, every time Joe Biden at the debate or Kamala Harris at the VP debate, they say that Trump said very fine people, and refuses to condemn white supremacy. Well, you know what? For some reason, they won't show you just 10 seconds earlier in that video after Charlottesville, where Trump said that the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists should be condemned completely. And then he said, the very fine people part of it, he was talking about the people that would argue that statues maybe should remain or not remain. And of course, we know that you could be a perfectly fine person and argue that certain statues should remain. That's a debate to be had. But he did condemn the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, but the media won't run with that. So then that leaves, to fully answer the question, it leaves YouTubers, podcasters, people that are outside of the mainstream to talk about those things. And it's very bizarre. It's like, guys, just do your job and I'll find some other things to talk about.
When you're talking about legacy media, one dimension of legacy media, certainly when you're looking at earlier eras, is that it was reaching a mass audience. And when you're looking at podcasting, when you're looking at YouTube, you're looking at audiences that are oftentimes very large, but they're niche audiences. And I wonder if that's something you think about, you reflect on. Would we be better off if the kind of content you're bringing was reaching the kind of audience that Walter Cronkite was reaching? Or is this something that we ought to embrace? The fact that we are speaking to niches, that you're going to see smaller communities that are kind of thinking these things through independently, and that we can't necessarily have this expectation of a kind of mass media that you saw in earlier generations.
Yeah, my bumper sticker answer would be that the second part of your question is the right idea, that smaller communities will be the future. I think you could use a lot of metaphors with that, but even the idea of big tech, that we thought 10 years ago that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, these giant things, they could bring us truth and connect us and make us happier, and you'd find community. And what have we really found? That in many ways, it's made us angrier. We now hate people we used to like. We spend all day fighting with people and the rest of it. And I think finding sort of smaller groups that you can identify with for some reason, and then hopefully what's now is on you. And I think this is the essence of the question. It's now on you to make sure that you're not locked in an echo chamber. And I myself can have issues with that, right? If my audience all believes one thing, well, I want to make sure I'm not catering my content to my audience. And that is a very tricky proposition. But as I just said before, I'm begrudgingly pro-choice. My audience at this point leans, I would say, fairly conservative in a traditional sense. And we've just sort of agreed to disagree on that. And that is okay. Let's not forget also that, it seems like another lifetime ago, but, it's only 2 elections ago that at one point, Rudy Giuliani was the leading contender at one point to be the Republican nominee. And he was pro-choice, and he still is pro-choice, and he was for gay marriage. So it's not, these things sort of change over time. And it gets to what I was saying before about about sort of that wide tent thing. But I think you could argue this either way. Would it be better if we only had 3 networks that sort of covered the same thing? You know, ABC, CBS, NBC, it's 1974, and the Overton window was sort of, you know, this wide. So whether you watched one of those channels might just depend whether you like Dan Rather or Peter Jennings or Tom Brokaw the best. But that as a country, the several hundred million of us, we all sort of believe the same thing. I think there's a national cohesion argument there that actually does make sense. Now, that's just not the world we live in. So we might like the idea of that. And by the way, that's not to say that some big stories wouldn't be missed, because if just 3 corporations can control all the information, there's obviously an issue there. But the world we live in now is people can find people that they basically trust to curate the news, to give them something sensible. I'm honored to be somebody that I guess people come to for that sort of thing. And I really do my best to tell people what my biases are. And I try to give them as much information as possible and let them make their own decisions. But this is why we're dealing with such tension right now. We had 3 networks, then suddenly we had cable news, then we had 24-hour cable news, which was just keeping us in the fight all the time. Then we had social media. And so the whole system of information, it's in flux right now. And it's like all of our institutions, our academic institutions that are crumbling, Hollywood that seems to be crumbling, the political institution. I mean, look, whether you like Biden or Trump, the idea that the presidency right now is being volleyed back and forth between a 77-year-old and a 74-year-old tells you that we're really at the end of a system that existed for a long time. And that is in large part because the internet has changed things in ways that are absolutely unimaginable, that even for those of us that live in the internet, like I'm a little internet person. And for those of us that live in the internet, I don't think we can even realize how much this thing has changed us. So I think you can argue it either way. My hope is that for anyone that comes to me for some information, that you'll also go to some people that are outside of me, because I'm doing the best I can, but I'm just one guy.
It does speak to the kind of classical liberal values you advance in the book. You know, when you have a society that is so deeply decentralized and individualistic, the idea that you're going to have one single political program that is going to solve all of your problems seems that much more delusional. You know, kind of it was always delusional, but perhaps more so now than before. A question from James.
By the way, I should say quickly that, you know, that's also why I don't consider myself a pure libertarian, because, you know, a lot of times people will say to me, well, Dave, you're for individual rights, you're for states' rights, limited government, low taxes. That sounds libertarian. And what I always say, and I describe this in the book, that the slim difference, that if someone was to whittle it down to what a classical liberal and a libertarian are, is that I see a little more almost unfortunate necessary use of the government. So I love the libertarian ideas. Just last week, I had Jo Jorgensen on, who's the libertarian presidential candidate. I agreed with her on a lot of the ideas, but unfortunately, we don't just live in a world of ideas. There's a realistic, I'm a realist, I think, more than anything else. So what a classical liberal, I think, has is the unfortunate need for the guardrails. You see that, where the libertarians generally, I think, don't see that. And that's not a knock on the libertarians, actually. I admire the sort of utopianness of it, but I just don't think it's a real world application. But do I ideologically believe in most of the things libertarians believe in? Yeah, I do.
Well, and for you, it's a lodestar. It's a direction of travel. It's the idea that we want some give. We're not going to be rigid about it. We're not going to be inflexible. Question from James. Let's assume that conservatives need to pick their culture war battles. Where does Dave think the energy should be focused? Pushing back on campuses, social media censorship? Is there some other area perhaps where you think that the energy ought to be focused?
Yeah, well, I think everybody has to fight in the arena that they can fight best. So, you know, if you're in college right now, James, if you're in college, like, probably the best place for you to fight is in college. And what that might mean is standing up to your professor if he's, you know, feeding you a lot of nonsense. And I know that can be scary and all of those things. But as I said before, when you get to the other side after you deal with the hit, you will feel better. You will be living in something that is more true to you, and I believe that is good. And, you know, I've referenced Jordan Peterson a couple times, who I was on tour with for a year and a half, And, you know, I think one of the things that he really captured well is that you have no idea how much order you can put in the world if you just sort yourself out first. You know, the meme of Jordan was this clean your room idea, that we have so many people, and I think we see this so much with the social justice warriors, they want to clean the world, meaning they want to fight all the injustice or perceived injustice in the world first. But it's like, take care of yourself first. And what that could mean is eating better, exercising a little bit, reading a little bit more, you know, whatever that means. And by the way, I'm not sitting here telling you I'm the perfect person. I'm obviously not. We all have our stuff, right? I mean, that's what life is. It's, I think, a constant battle between your stuff and fixing yourself, or order and chaos within the Jordan idea. But I would say if you're on a college campus, maybe you can fight it that way. If we, as let's say right-leaning people, have to focus, well, I talk a lot about big tech. I spent a lot of time going to colleges and fighting it at the college level. You know, one of the interesting criticisms that I got for a couple of years, and sort of my YouTube crew of people would say, oh, you guys, this is all just happening on college campuses and you guys are making it too big of a deal about it. And when these kids get out of college, the real world's going to hit them in the face, and this is just nonsense. And I have to pat myself on the back, I suppose, a little bit, because I just felt it would leak out. It wasn't nothing. And I think what we're seeing now is it has leaked out. So if you're a right-leaning person, I think you got to fight it in whatever realm you can. If the realm that you can fight it is just within your family, meaning at the dinner table to discuss the right ideas, that's one way of doing it. I think fighting it, you know, being on social media and telling people what you genuinely think, and not being bullied into posting something because you don't want to get hate or whatever. I think do it that way. I think we have to fight big tech. I think we have to fight sort of all of the bad messaging out there. I don't know that there's sort of one answer, like that's just the place we should focus. I think you just sort of have to figure out what works for you.
Question from Chris. Dave lives and works out of California. You often hear conservatives express their concern that America will go the way of California. Does Dave think that's likely? And if not, why not?
Oh man, well, I certainly hope not. And I should tell you that I was born in Brooklyn. I grew up in Long Island. I lived in Manhattan most of my life. As I said before, I went to college in upstate New York at SUNY Binghamton. And then the only other place that I've lived besides New York is California. So I'm a New York and California guy, and yet I think that most of the people watching this are probably going, well, a lot of the stuff you talk about, it sounds like middle America stuff. I don't know exactly how that happened to me specifically. But look, you don't want America going the way of California. San Francisco, everyone knows this. This is not hyperbole or sarcasm. San Francisco has become a disaster. The homelessness, the drug use, the skyrocketing rental, apartment fees, and all of those things. There's literally an app. There is an app that will tell you where human feces is on the street so that you can avoid those streets. I mean, this is not made up stuff. I was there a few months ago, and the amount of people that I saw doing drugs, asking for money, this is not disconnected from progressive policies. And yet the strange thing is that who was the mayor that oversaw most of those bad policies? It was Gavin Newsom, the mayor of San Francisco, who is now the governor of California. For some reason, these people seem to always fail up. One of the things I've really been trying to explain to people here in California, because I see this all the time. I'm walking my dog and I meet a neighbor, and whether they know who I am or not, you just start talking about things. And where I live off the main boulevard here, there's a ton of stores that are closed. It's starting to look like a shanty town almost. And we'll talk about it. And what I've really been trying to implore these people to understand is that doesn't have nothing to do with the people we vote in. If we keep only voting Democrats in, and then wait a minute, we see our taxes go up, everyone sees that education is bad, we see homelessness go up, we see all these bad things. Well, maybe it has something to do with the one-party government that we've put here in California. I'll end this by saying that a few months ago, I was strongly considering leaving. And as you know, Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire left. They're in Nashville now. Joe Rogan left, and now he's in Austin, Texas. And I strongly thought about it. And my feeling was, if someone like me, who really is, I'm a moderate, really, if someone like me can't live in California, then in many ways, the experiment of America really is done. The idea that we could have these 50 states and they could make rules for themselves, and yet we would fold into the United States of America. Well, if someone like me can't live in California and has to go to a red state, then the experiment really is almost done. And I want to stay and fight. And I know that there are other good people who want to stay and fight. And I suspect this election is going to show us that there are more fighters than you might think.
Question from John. Dave has lived in 2 deep blue areas, and his professional milieus were certainly left-wing heavy. Does that make him think he's hyper-attuned to progressive censoriousness, but undersells conservative political intolerance?
I love this question because I watch out for this, right? Because one thing that happens is when you're part of one group and then you see what's wrong with one group, and for me, I spent years talking about it as a lefty, and I kept saying us. You can watch all my videos when I first started talking about classical liberalism more, and I started saying, we the left are not being liberal anymore. You can see what I was trying to do was reform the left from the inside. Let's deal with our stuff, right? And then I was welcomed by all sorts of people that 5 years ago I would have thought were my ideological opponents, from Dennis Prager and Glenn Beck and Ben Shapiro and the rest. So is it possible that because I went from one thing that has become really hysterical in nature, and I was one of the first people to really be calling it out, that I might have a blind spot as to what is happening on the right? Well, I will be totally honest. I think it is possible. Now, I really do my best to try to find what those places are. And what I can tell you is, and I alluded to this earlier, I have found conservatives and right-leaning people to be far more welcoming of other opinions than people on the left. So again, most of my audience is right-leaning, yet I take a pro-gay marriage argument and a pro-choice argument and an anti-death penalty argument in my book, and they're okay with it. So I can't tell you that I have no blind spot, because now it's sort of like if you were welcomed, let's say you were in a home for a while with a group of people and everyone there was going crazy, and you worked on trying to get everybody to something decent and something sane, didn't work. And then some new people across the street invite you over, and you thought you had some differences with them, but you get into their home. Well, now you want to be respectful of them. And might that cause you to have a little bit longer leash than you would with the other guys? That's absolutely possible. I mean, that truly is the most honest answer I can give you. I just don't see it specifically. And I'll say one other thing about, I went to this Trump rally by chance. I wasn't even trying to go to a Trump rally. Last week in Beverly Hills, I was driving home and there was a Trump rally, and I stopped because I just wanted to see what it was like. And you know what? I met black people and white people and gay people and straight people and Latino people and Indian people and everything else, and nobody cared. So that isn't to say that there's no blind spot on that side, but it is to say that there's something brewing there that is very different than the other thing. But I love the question, and I hope people will continue to call me out on it if they see it.
One observation that's been made, and you can tell me if you think it's fair or not, but is that the intellectual dark web, its audience is very heavily male. And I wonder what you think about that. Having spent a lot of time with Jordan Peterson, it's also often been said that the people who are his greatest devotees tend to be men, oftentimes younger men. Is there something going on in our society with younger men that is making them seek out voices like this one, like yours? And is there something where, maybe there are ways to reach more women that just aren't being done?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple ways to answer this. When I was on tour with Jordan, we would hear this criticism all the time. All the articles would say it's all angry young men. And I always thought it was such an odd criticism. Well, first off, because it wasn't true. I mean, the audiences usually, and I would say this at the beginning of the show, it usually was about 60-40 male to female, something like that. It was, I assure you, it was not
90-10.
It was not 90-10. It was not 80-20. And I don't even think it was 70-30. It was usually about 60-40, something like that. So that was one thing, that they were just sort of factually wrong. But the other thing was, I always thought it was an odd criticism, because let's say it was 90-10, and it was even angry, all angry young men, which it wasn't. But let's just say that was correct. Well, if all of those people, that 90% was showing up and had some issue in life that they were dealing with, that let them feel left out or left behind or whatever it might be. And then here is this clinical psychologist who in essence is telling them to right themselves, deal with the world seriously so that they can fix themselves. And by the way, I saw and met thousands and thousands of people that fixed themselves, that had gotten off drugs, that had bettered their relationships. I mean, the stories that I could tell you are mind-blowing, absolutely mind. I'll tell you one real quick. We were outside of the show in Dublin, and when you're leaving a theater like this, obviously the performers don't walk out the main entrance because there's usually a lot of people out there. There's usually a side entrance, and Jordan and I walked out after a very long day of travel and media appearances and the talk and everything else, meet and greets, and it's midnight. And we were pretty tired. We were about to head back to the hotel, and about 20 feet in the alley, 20 feet away from us, we saw two men. One of them was probably about 60. One of them was probably in his mid-20s, and they were both crying. And they saw us, and they ran right up to us. And it turned out that it was a father and son who hadn't seen each other for about 5 years, yet they had both read 12 Rules for Life and attended the show and saw each other there and made amends. And they stood there and told us that while crying. And Jordan began to cry. I teared up. Our tour manager was with us. He did as well. And that's just one little story of the type of thing that I saw there. So the idea that, even if it was 90% angry young men, well, if you're making those people's lives better and more full and more functional, and giving them a sense of purpose, well, then I would see that as a great thing. This really goes to the heart of why we've put so much emphasis on equity instead of reality, I would say. It's like, okay, so can you only perform for 50% male, 50% female? What percentage of gay people are there in the world? Well, then that's the exact amount of percentage of people we need there. And there's, whatever it is, 13% of Americans are black. So we need 13% of Americans, 13% of the audience to be black. It's a crazy way of looking at the world. So I would say, but to the latter part of the question, which is there something happening with young men? I think there probably is. I think there's a lot of evidence that as the family structure has faltered and as fathers have become in many ways distant or unable to handle their duties and a lot of that sort of stuff, I think it's left a lot of young men just sort of waving in the wind, not exactly sure where to go. I would also say that that criticism about the IDW in general, about that it was more male-centric, you can look at the metrics on YouTube, and YouTube happens to be more male-centric. Generally, more males watch YouTube videos and listen to podcasts than females. That is just a fact. So can we always do more outreach to find more women or find more whatever it might be? Sure, but we're all I'm just putting stuff out there, and I hope that men watch it and women watch it and whoever else.
One of the arguments you raise in the book is that free-thinking people are becoming the new counterculture. When you think about conservatism in recent decades, it's seen as a creed of societies less fashionable. Whereas when you're looking at progressive orthodoxy, it's embraced by the young, it's embraced by celebrities, it's embraced by the glamorous and successful. So I wonder, do you think this is poised for change? When you think about the world, 5 years from now, do you imagine that our political culture is going to look very different because of this new counterculture?
Oh yeah, it's going to look unbelievably different, almost completely unrecognizable. The day of celebrity, of big Hollywood, of being lectured by millionaires about how racist we all are, and then come to our movie, that is coming to an end. I think that whatever happens with this election, whatever happens with the Trump thing in general, it has caused, and I ultimately think this is a good thing, it is the thing that broke the system in a way that needed to be broken. The line that I was using before the election is, I think most of us wanted a panther in a china shop. We wanted a panther to walk in and slyly move in and knock something off with its tail and knock one thing off with its head and then calmly close the door on the way out. I think that's what most people wanted, meaning that most people thought there's something wrong with our media, with our political establishment. Something's not quite right, but we don't want to blow up the thing. Now, the problem is that the metaphor is not a panther in a china shop. The metaphor is a bull in a china shop, and that's what we got with Trump. So yes, does it feel like there's a lot of chaos right now? Does it feel like, the chessboard's been thrown upside down and we don't know where to put the pieces? Of course it does. But if we keep our heads on straight, and I think a lot of people are realizing this, if we believe in something outside of just politics, if we commit ourselves to our family and our local communities and all those things, we can reorder this thing. We've been through worse than this. You know, a lot of people seem to always think, oh, this is the worst. This is just the worst. Well, it's like we've been through a civil war. We fought Nazis. We fought communism. We've been through worse, I assure you, as you're sitting there on your iPhone. You know, it's like, you know, tweeting to people. It's like we've been through worse and we will get through this. But, you know, as far as the culture war and how it sort of morphs and changes, it's like if you would have told me, I was a big video game guy when I was a kid. I even ended up my first job out of college when I was doing stand-up. I don't like to brag, but I was an assistant manager at electronics boutique, which you might know as GameStop. And, you know, remember, it's only 20 some odd years ago that it was mostly right-leaning Republicans and conservatives that were all upset about Mortal Kombat because there was violence in video games and there was blood in Mortal Kombat. And the Sega Genesis version of Mortal Kombat, they left the blood in, but they took it out for the Super Nintendo version. That was a type of censorship, and I think a very flawed argument by people on the right. So these things are cyclical. They, you know, and it could come around again that the right will be that way and the left will be the other way. But right now that isn't how it is, and you got to deal with the world as it is.
I want to get in two more questions. I know your time is limited, Dave. So one is a question from Emily. I think Dave's point about Jordan Peterson's influence on people is correct. Does he think the Peterson effect is instructive for social conservatives? That they should be less focused on sexual behavior and more on the loneliness and purposelessness in society? Or are those issues that just can't be reached by politics and politicians?
It's a great question. I would say that, I mean, I think this has been a theme of everything we've talked about here. It's on you to fix your life. It's on you to figure out what gives you purpose, what gives you a reason to wake up in the morning and everything else. So for example, there were times in my life when I was closeted about my sexuality or whatever it might be, that I wasn't living as a full person. You know, it's like life is like being a painter, and what you would want as a painter is you would want access to all the colors so that you can paint in the most robust possible way. And if you're closeted about something, if you're not saying what you think about something, it's like saying, well, okay, I'm going to paint, but I'm not going to use blue. Well, guess what? Your work, your life will not be as full, will not be as colorful and as rich as someone that has all of those things. So I think, to Emily's question, it is on you to figure out what you're supposed to be doing here. I now live a life where I have a lot of purpose. I would say in some ways, I almost have too much purpose. I don't have a minute during the day that I don't have something to do. You know, even before we started this live stream, I was sitting there in the Zoom box with, you know, your crew and everything. And it's like, I have a million emails here that I got to get to. And I have 2 companies now and a whole bunch of stuff, but I love it. That's the thing. I wake up every day and I know, man, I have got work to do. There's things that I want to do. I get to talk to all sorts of interesting people like you. I get to share the ideas that I believe in and care about. Like, that is what purpose is. But it only came because there was a time in my life when I didn't have that purpose. I didn't know what to do and why to do it. But you got to go through the muck to get there. You gotta, you know, as Jordan would say, you have to slay that dragon. And whatever your stuff is, you came from abusive parents, you were addicted to drugs or to porn or whatever your stuff is. And we all have versions, you know, our stuff, we always think our situation is the worst. Your personal situation is the worst, but we all have this stuff. And it's not that, it's your job to slay that dragon and then move forward in life. And it's not to say that you slay it in just one moment and then bam, your world is better and you have purpose and meaning and all of those things. But if you start going, okay, whatever my stuff is there, and I gotta get through it so that I can find something. Again, this would be a Jordan thing, so that I can find that star in the distance, and go for that. Well, then you will find purpose. So to answer Emily's question fully, you're not going to find that in politics. You're just not, and that is why most of the things we've talked about here, you know, we've been talking about politics. But I haven't sat here saying these are the policies that we must instill to ensure that we will all be happy, because I just don't believe that exists.
It's this false belief that, you know, this deep longing that people have, this spiritual longing that they have is going to be fulfilled by politics, that in a way is why our political life has gone so haywire. So
can I just say one other quick
course.
thing on that? It's so interesting. Like, if you listen to AOC, 12 years from now, we've got 12 years to solve the environment. So she's using apocalyptic language that has now been adopted by the left. And Biden, who has a slew of problems, but Biden knows it's not true. Biden knows that the world isn't going to end in 12 years. And he certainly knows that the Green New Deal ain't going to be the thing that solves it, as if he can instill a policy. I guess him and Barack just never thought about doing it, but now she comes in and she figured it out. But the religious nature of that there is something that is going to kill you in 12 years. You are part of the problem, and only we, if you vote us in and give us enough power and enough money, we are the ones who can solve it. No, that is deeply, deeply dangerous.
Yes. So one last question. I'm going to kind of mishmash a couple of things here. Question from Hank. What are 3 books Dave would recommend for a young person trying to think about politics, political philosophy, and ideas generally? And I'll put a slight spin on it. If you are reaching out to a friend, as many of us in this audience are right now, someone you want to open their minds, just name a couple of books for us that you think are the right things to use. So clearly, number 1 is a gimme. Number 1 is your book.
I'm going to scribble
some. Be on the list.
Don't even worry about
apart from yours.
I'm going to scribble some down so I don't lose them all as a book. Well, I happen, I'm on my set right now, and I have many books right behind me that are slightly out of frame here that you can't see that have been hugely influential on me. So one that you can read literally in just a couple hours, and I have it in my nightstand, and I tell everyone to read it, is you should read On Liberty. You should read On Liberty if you want just the basic understandings of why liberty and freedom and staying away from coercion of government is important. And you could literally read it in 3 hours. And you probably should read it a couple of times, because there's some language in there that's a little more complicated than what you're going to get on CNN these days. I would say, I have it right here, 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, who's the co-founder of PayPal and the tech billionaire, and he's become a good friend of mine. Although it's not specifically political, his point of 0 to 1, I mean, the main thrust of the book is find new ideas. And I think one of the things that we're finding right now is, and I sort of said this before, is we have the 77-year-old running against the 74-year-old. We're at the end of a certain set of ideas. That's not good, it's not bad, it just is. That life is cyclical. And 0 to 1 is about don't just do what someone else has done before and make it a little different. Do something new altogether. And then Peter lays out in the book, and it's actually quite a short book too. You can read it in a day probably. Several of the things, in essence, the next Mark Zuckerberg isn't gonna create Facebook 2. He's gonna do something else completely. So I think that's an important one. If you want to read a really great book that's not political but also philosophical, that not a ton of people have read, I don't think. Billions and Billions by Carl Sagan. And Carl obviously was the astronomer and an incredible science communicator, before Neil deGrasse Tyson, and before, being a scientist was kind of cool. He was the one that was doing it. And he wrote the book Cosmos, of course, and the movie Contact with Jodie Foster was his only work of nonfiction. It's one of my favorite movies, and I read the book. But Billions and Billions is the last book he ever wrote. He actually passed away from cancer. He died of cancer right before the ending of the book. So his wife, who was also a professor at Cornell, Ann Druyan, she actually finished the book for him. She wrote the last chapter. But he's just a wonderful explainer of big ideas and science and things that we should, and tribalism and the things that we should be wary of and things like that. And then let me look behind me and see if I got one. Oh, well, my good friend who's been on the show many times, Douglas Murray, his last book, The Madness of Crowds, I think is one of the best explainers of what is happening to us right now, about how, because we have become so afraid of the mob, that we are now debating things that we know shouldn't be debated. And I always quote Douglas on this. I love this line, that what in essence is happening to us right now is the barbarians are at the gate. They're there. We all know they're there. And what are we doing? We're debating what gender pronoun we should call them. And I think he's got that British wit, and it's a spectacular book.
Dave, you have gone above and beyond the call of duty. You have given us 4 books rather than 3, and you've been incredibly generous with your time. Thank you so much. This has been great fun, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Again, do yourselves a favor and go out and buy Dave's new book, Don't Burn This Book, Thinking for Yourself in an Age of Unreason. For those of you in the audience who are not YLC members and who are interested in joining, I'd encourage you to take a look at the link on your screen. It would be an honor to have you. Thank you, and see you all soon.
Thank you.